The Zyrene Empire prided itself on conquest. They had subjugated over 100 worlds, their rule unquestioned, their dominance absolute. Their warriors, bred for battle over generations, believed in strength above all else. To challenge a Zyrene in combat was to accept certain death. From her throne of obsidian and gold, Queen Zyra watched the assembled envoys with a glimmer of amusement. The Galactic Concord, a loose coalition of lesser species, had sent their finest representatives to negotiate peace, but Zyra had no interest in diplomacy. Peace was the language of the weak. "You speak of treaties and coexistence," she said, her voice smooth yet edged with contempt. "But strength, not words, determines the fate of empires, and humanity has yet to prove it has any." The human delegate, a gray-haired statesman named Arun Voss, sat stiff-backed but composed. Around him, alien diplomats shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the Zyrene's history with challengers. Voss met the Queen's gaze, his expression impassive. "Humanity has already proven its resilience. We have survived our own wars, disasters, and near extinction. We do not seek conflict, but we do not bow." Zyra leaned forward. "Then prove it in the way that matters. A duel, my champion against yours." A ripple of tension spread through the chamber. The Zyrene were infamous for such trials, offering their opponents a single chance to prove their worth. The price of failure was humiliation or annihilation. Voss exhaled slowly. "We are not a species of gladiators. Then decline, and the galaxy will see what I already know. Humans are nothing but fragile creatures clinging to borrowed power." The challenge was clear. The trap was set. If humanity refused, it would confirm its inferiority. If it accepted, it risked annihilation. The diplomatic council on Earth debated for hours. Some called the duel a farce, an unwinnable fight designed to cripple humanity's standing. Others saw opportunity. A single, decisive victory could alter the balance of power. In the end, there was only one real choice. The challenge was accepted. Elias Voss had no illusions about what he was walking into. The Zyrene were larger, stronger, and trained from birth to kill. But they were also predictable. They fought with overwhelming force, expecting lesser foes to crumble. He was no stranger to the arena. Once a soldier, then a duelist by necessity, he had spent years mastering the art of precision combat. Strength could be countered. Speed, skill, and an understanding of an opponent's weaknesses. That was where real victory lay. The Zyrene selected their champion, Scarrath, the undefeated, a warrior whose name was whispered with reverence. 7 feet of raw muscle, clad in armor that pulsed with living energy, wielding a plasma-forged war spear that had felled entire squads. Elias merely nodded when he heard the name. It made no difference. The arena on Vareth was vast, carved from ancient stone and lined with towering statues of Zyrene warlords. Tens of thousands filled the stands, their voices a chorus of bloodlust and anticipation. Zyra sat high above, her golden eyes gleaming as she watched the human walk onto the battlefield. Elias moved without fear, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. A hush fell as Scarrath emerged, his spear clashing against the stone with every step. He loomed over Elias, his mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. "You are small," the Zyrene rumbled. "Weak." Elias rolled his shoulders, testing his grip on the mono-edged saber at his hip. "That's what they always say." The Queen raised her hand. The duel was about to begin. The arena was silent for a breath, the weight of expectation pressing down on the gathered masses. Then, with a single downward motion of Queen Zyra's hand, the duel began. Scarrath moved first, the ground trembling beneath his charge. He was a force of nature, his war spear crackling with plasma energy as he thrust it forward in a blur of motion. For a warrior of his size, his speed was shocking. The Zyrene did not waste time with testing blows. They sought to end battles in an instant. Elias had already stepped aside before the strike fully extended. The spear's energy blade carved through empty space, sizzling against the air where he had stood moments before. He moved with a fluid efficiency that contrasted the raw brutality of his opponent, his feet barely touching the stone as he circled out of reach. The crowd roared as Scar-Wrath twisted, sweeping the spear in a wide arc. Elias ducked beneath it, the heat of the weapon brushing against his hair as it passed overhead. He kept moving, never giving the Zyrene a stationary target. A flicker of irritation crossed Scar-Wrath's face. He planted his foot, pivoting into another strike, this time aimed lower, calculated to catch his opponent mid-dodge. Elias met it with his saber, the mono-edge blade intercepting the spear in a burst of sparks. The impact sent a tremor through his arm, but he absorbed it, redirecting the force rather than resisting it. For a moment, they locked eyes. The Zyrene's expression was one of expectation. He had fought enough lesser beings to know what came next. The human would falter. The strength difference would take its toll. The duel would end in seconds. Elias shifted his grip and let the force of the clash push him into motion. Instead of bracing against the impact, he used it, rolling to the side and coming up behind his opponent. His blade flashed, slicing across the Zyrene's shoulder. A shallow cut, but a deliberate one. The crowd's roar faltered. A human had drawn first blood. Scar-Wrath's mandibles flared in something between rage and disbelief. He spun, spear stabbing downward, aiming to pin Elias to the ground. Elias was already moving. He didn't retreat. He stepped forward, inside the Zyrene's reach, where the length of the spear became a liability. He brought his saber up in a tight arc, the edge kissing the shaft of the weapon as he guided it just wide enough to miss. Then he twisted, pivoting on his back foot, and drove his elbow into the Zyrene's exposed ribs. It was like striking stone, but the intent wasn't damage. It was disruption. Scar-Wrath staggered, thrown off balance by the unexpected maneuver. Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped past him, turned, and with a single fluid motion, sliced through the lower half of the war spear. The crowd's voice died in an instant. Scar-Wrath stumbled back, staring at the now useless weapon in his grip. His breath came faster, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. He had never lost his weapon before. Elias stood a few paces away, his saber still raised, but his stance relaxed. He met the Zyrene's gaze without a hint of gloating. Scar-Wrath let the ruined spear fall from his grasp. His claws flexed. The duel was not over. Scar-Wrath exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the humiliation of losing his weapon. His mandibles flared, but his eyes narrowed with cold focus. The duel had shifted, but he was not beaten. He had trained for war his entire life, and his strength did not come from his weapon alone. He lunged, faster than before. The loss of the spear had not hindered him. It had freed him, no longer bound by the need for reach. He closed the distance with terrifying efficiency, his massive hands striking out in a blur. Elias barely avoided the first blow. A clawed fist grazed his shoulder, the force behind it enough to send a lesser man crumpling. He twisted, evading a second strike, but Scar-Wrath was relentless. His sheer size allowed him to dominate the space between them, cutting off escape routes, forcing Elias to react rather than dictate the flow. The Zyrene fought like a force of nature, but Elias fought like a man who had mastered the nature of force. He didn't need to overpower. He needed to unbalance. As another strike came, he stepped toward it instead of away, turning his body at the last second so the attack barely missed. He redirected the momentum, guiding Scar-Wrath just off-center, just enough to throw him slightly out of alignment. Then he struck, a precise cut along the inside of the Zyrene's forearm, just deep enough to weaken his grip. Scar-Wrath barely reacted, but Elias saw the shift in his posture, the slight hesitation, the fraction of a second where he reassessed. Good. He could work with that. Scar-Wrath roared and came at him again, abandoning all restraint. His movements were raw, animalistic, meant to break rather than wound. Elias allowed himself to be driven back, reading the pattern, waiting for the inevitable overreach. It came soon. The Zyrene, emboldened by the retreat, overcommit. A downward strike meant to crush. Elias sidestepped and pivoted, letting the attack slam into the stone. Before Scarrath could recover, Elias struck, not with his blade but with his knee, driving it into the Zyrene's exposed ribs. The force was surgical, not brute strength but perfectly placed kinetic impact. Scarrath staggered, gasping as his body betrayed him. His exoskeletal armor had absorbed most of the damage, but the shock had reached through, disrupting his breath, his balance. Elias pressed the advantage. A step forward, a sharp elbow to the side of the head, another precise cut across the back of the knee. Each strike was a chisel against the statue, carving away at the illusion of invulnerability. Scarrath swung wildly, desperation creeping into his attacks. He was no longer fighting to win. He was fighting not to lose. And that made all the difference. Elias saw the opening. The Zyrene lunged and Elias dropped low, pivoting beneath the strike. As he rose, his saber flashed, its edge whispering across the warrior's throat in a controlled, perfect arc. Silence fell. Scarrath froze, his breath caught in his chest. A thin red line marked where the blade had passed, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to end the fight. His hands twitched as if willing themselves to move, to keep fighting, but his body had already surrendered. Then slowly he collapsed to his knees. Elias took a step back, his saber still poised, his breathing measured. He had known this fight would not be about brute force. It had been about control, precision, and he had controlled the battle from the moment it began. The arena remained deathly silent. Above, Queen Zyra's golden eyes narrowed. Her champion had fallen, and with him, the illusion of Zyrene supremacy. The silence stretched long enough to feel unnatural. The Zyrene did not know silence. Their arenas were temples to violence, their battles celebrated with unrestrained fury. But now, the crowd sat in stunned quiet, tens of thousands of golden eyes fixed on the figure kneeling in defeat. Scarrath did not rise. His breathing was heavy, his body trembling from exertion, but the deeper wound was to his pride. He had never been defeated, not by his own kind, not by the many species that had stood before him in this very arena. And yet, before him stood a human, smaller, weaker in appearance, who had stripped away his invincibility in mere moments. Elias Voss took a step back, lowering his saber. He did not gloat, did not revel in the moment. The victory was already etched into history. There was no need for spectacle. Then, from above, a slow, deliberate clap echoed through the chamber. Queen Zyra had risen from her throne, her golden eyes locked onto Elias with an expression that revealed nothing. Her applause was measured, almost mocking, yet beneath it was something else. Consideration, perhaps even amusement. "You fight well, human," she said at last, her voice carrying through the arena. "Better than I expected." Scarrath's mandibles tightened, but he said nothing. He had no right to speak. Elias gave a small nod. "I fight to win, and so you have—" Zyra's gaze flicked to her fallen champion before returning to Elias. "Tell me, Duelist, what do you believe this victory has earned you?" He met her eyes without hesitation. Respect. A murmur rippled through the Zyrene. It was a simple answer, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Zyra tilted her head slightly, as if tasting the word. Then she smiled, sharp and knowing. Perhaps. The duel was over, but its consequences had only begun to take shape. Across the galaxy, news of Scarrath's defeat spread like wildfire. The Zyrene, long considered the pinnacle of martial strength, had been humbled, and by a human. Among the other species of the galactic concord, opinions shifted. Where once humanity had been viewed as an untested power, now they were something else, something unpredictable. Some saw opportunity, reaching out with tentative alliances. Others saw a threat, reevaluating their own positions. And in the halls of the Zyrene War Council, whispers of doubt crept through the ranks. Zyra sat alone in her chambers, watching the duels recording in silence. She studied Elias's movements, his precision, the way he had dictated the rhythm of battle. The Zyrene had always believed strength was absolute, that size and power determined dominance. But Elias had fought with something different, something dangerous. Adaptability. A slow smile played at the corners of her lips. Perhaps she had been too hasty in dismissing humanity. Perhaps they were more than just another species to be conquered. Perhaps they were worth watching. Elias returned to Earth without ceremony. There were celebrations, of course, but he took no part in them. He had done what needed to be done. That was enough. As he stood on the balcony of the Concord Embassy, gazing up at the endless expanse of stars, a message arrived on his personal communicator. A single line. No sender. No signature. "We will meet again, Duelist." He exhaled, a small smile touching his lips. The game had only just begun.